You're going to find out when you try the next progression whether you've built up enough strength or not, because you go to the next progression and just fall down, then you're going to need to use some of these tools we're going to show you in a second to help bridge those gaps.
So Jacko, show us the next progression, which is going to be knee off, and then we're going to show you two ways that we can use the tools in the locker to be able to play around with this and go backwards and forwards, regress or progress. So normally our frog stand progression will be here, so we're nice, we're stable, we can hold that for say 10 seconds or so, we feel like we've got control of the movement. The next thing to do is for Jacko to take a knee off. Now this takes a little bit more preparation. We have to get ready to take to move that leg. We have to fire the shoulders up, create some stability in the chain, because effectively we're reducing the amount of support that the body's being provided. So we have to recreate that somewhere else because we're not able to just rest on that leg anymore. So to use the tools from the locker, this is an isometric in itself, but we're going to use an assistance tool as well. And what I'm going to get Jacko to do is go into that same position. When he takes that leg off, he can just use that one foot to dab the toe on the ground to give himself a little bit of support. So it's less weight than having the knee just hanging free off the ground, but it's still a progression moving forwards using that assistance tool of making it a little bit more difficult and moving in a direction. So why don't you show us that, Dave?
So you can see a little bit.
So he goes back into a frog stand, hips are nice and high. This leg's going to come off, and then he's just going to start to dab that toe on the floor a little bit on the left leg as this knee comes into that hang position. You can just play around with how much force you're putting down to that stance leg, or the left leg on this case, as to how difficult or how easy you want to make this. But it's starting to give you a feel, if you can just literally just dab that down super gently, of where you're going to have to recreate that base of support when you take the knee off the elbow.
I think we'll cover a couple of things that are really important to make sure you don't do on this, just to highlight, is the reason would be if I take this leg off and my hip drops down and I just fall, you know that that's just too difficult for you. I've not created any tension, I'm just falling down. The other thing is then, so you go to put your foot down, when I take this leg off, does my hip stay in the same position, or do I put this foot down, rely on it, let that hip drop down, I'm just really, I can actually take my hand off the floor and then put it back on? Then I'm just kidding myself that I'm not actually, I'm using that assistance tool of that other foot way too much. So the real key of these progressions for those frog stands, and why Tim's so good at those, is it's having those hips set on top of the knee, on top of the elbow, on top of the hand and the wrist stacked, and that when you take one of those legs off, that hip position doesn't move backwards.
We use this phrase about our approach to calisthenics. We're always looking to create a stable foundation from which we can move to the next progression. In that frog stand, the stable foundation is the hips staying high. That means that we can then move to the next progression. If we're not stable there and the hips drop down straight away, we've lost that base, that stable foundation, and we're really going to find it quite difficult to progress and move forwards. So that's a great example of the assistance tool, just using the toe to move forwards. Again, there's no magic number. It really comes down to where you feel comfortable and confident to start to move around. But you want to feel like you've nailed that frog stand down for a decent amount of time first.
And it is a really nice one for bridging that gap between, I've got comfortable with a frog stand now, and maybe I can move around a bit, but when I take that leg off, or I can't even take that leg off, or when I do, it just falls straight back down. That's quite a common one, because it's a progression if you've got a certain amount of strength, but it can be quite a big step sometimes for people. So just using that toe down, just dabbing it, just really helps bridge that gap for a lot of people.
Yeah. And the last thing in all of these, the frog stands, you've got to keep pushing. Don't forget that we're doing an isometric movement in itself, and that requires us to be providing or producing maximal force into the ground. We don't want to just be like resting on the hands. Even with all of these progressions, you should be literally pushing down as hard as you can for the duration. That's going to mean that it shortens the amount of time you can do it for, but we have to do that if we're going to start to encourage the strength development, because that's where most people are going to be limited when they start to try and progress. They're just not strong enough in here, and we can make sure we're training that by pushing into the ground hard all the time. Let's look at the next one, levers and angles. So if we're going to move, if we're going to change the lever length or the angle that we're training at, it's going to make an exercise easier or more difficult. So an example might be a tuck human flag with the knees bent rather than the straight leg, fully out, or the same with a planche. With the frog stand, we can apply a really nice progression to. If we're struggling to take both knees off, show us that, Dave.
So we might get to a point where you can take one off and you're happy, hips don't move, but when you try and take both off,
we lose it. So we need a halfway house in between there. So we can actually take the single leg variation, but rather than having both knees tucked in, which is actually going to put quite a lot of weight in, we can extend the lever length to make one of these legs longer. So Dave's going to just extend one leg out. And whilst it actually looks like, in some terms, making a lever longer would be a progression, make it more difficult. But in this case, it's actually just distributing force wider over the base of support. So it's lengthening the lever, but it's providing a bit more of a seesaw effect, which makes the balance easier. Having both of those knees tucked in a small tuck tight, which is effectively like a tuck position, puts a low demand on the shoulders because you're having to hold a lot of weight in a very short space.
You're holding both the legs off your knees, whereas with that one leg out straight, yes, the lever length challenges you, but you've still got one leg on your elbow, and so that's what makes it a nice little progression for you or a little stepping stone or bridge to being able to take two off. I'm a little bit out of breath. You can see they're not that easy.
So that's a real simple example of our levers and angles. We're changing the lever length to play around with the difficulty to progress an exercise in that case. Again, the height that you're going to move that to can affect how difficult it is, whether it's lower and more planche or higher into more of a handstand position. So again, play around with it, see what works for you. You're ultimately trying to find points where you can hold a progression maximally for about 10 seconds. Yep. For reps and sets turns, if you can start to find that progression where you're about 10 seconds and you can do 4 to 6 sets of those, you're really starting to rack up some good time on attention. That's going to be the major kind of nuts and bolts moving forward. The exercise is one thing, but the amount of time that you can actually stimulate that maximal tension isometric hold is going to be the key.
Yeah, and making sure you give yourself a decent bit of rest, so like a couple of minutes rest in between those maximal effort. There needs to be maximal effort to create that adaptation. That's going to help you build up that sort of really specific, or we would call applied strength for your frogs. Eventually going to turn those rotating up then into those handstands.
Great. So that's it for this week's how-to.
Yep.
Dave, you have to do this.
Yeah, the how-to is. So that was part 1. Keep an eye out for part 2 and 3. But if you haven't subscribed, click up there by my head. If you haven't got a free guide, I know loads of you follow us, but you actually haven't downloaded the free guide yet. So make sure you get that there. That's absolutely free. Video tutorials to help you get started. And then if for one of our other how-tos, check up there. So until next week.
Class dismissed.